The auction house was alive with the restless energy of wealth and expectation. Velvet-clad seats hosted well-dressed bidders, each holding numbered paddles in their manicured hands, their expressions alternating between boredom and calculation. Stable hands led horses through the grand arena, their coats shining under the golden glow of chandeliers. Some horses were admired, their pedigrees announced with reverence, while others were dismissed with a mere flick of a wrist, their worth determined in an instant. At the far end of the room, just beyond the polished rows of seats, stood a man who did not belong. His boots were scuffed, his jacket well worn, and the way he carried himself suggested a quiet endurance, the kind built over years of hardship. He did not fidget like the wealthy buyers who placed bids, as if tossing away pocket change. His gaze was steady, sharp, locked onto the scene before him as if he saw something no one else did. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as people noticed him. He felt their eyes grazing over him, their silent judgments heavier than words. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a voice like rolling thunder, continued his practiced cadence, selling each horse with a flourish. The man at the back remained unnoticed until he stepped forward. A moment of hesitation preceded his movement. His hands, rough with calluses, clenched at his sides before he approached the registration table. The woman behind the desk barely spared him a glance. "This area is for registered bidders only," she said briskly, shuffling through her stack of papers. "I'm here to bid," he replied, his voice even, though it carried an edge of defiance. The woman's brows lifted. Her eyes flicked over his worn attire, the way his shoulders squared despite the judgment pressing down on him. She didn't bother hiding her skepticism. "Do you have a deposit?" He slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. The moment her fingers brushed the parchment, her smirk faltered. She unfolded it, scanned the official stamp, the large sum listed in firm, ink numbers. The change in her demeanor was instant, shoulders straightening, voice smoothing into something far more polite. "My apologies, sir," she murmured, handing him a numbered paddle. "You're free to place bids." Despite the formalities, whispers spread through the room. The auctioneer barely concealed his distaste as he glanced at the newest participant. To them, he was an outsider, an intruder in a world where money dictated worth. He knew their type well. The auction continued. Horses came and went, some fetching extravagant sums, others dismissed with disinterest. Then, the murmurs quieted as the stable doors swung open, revealing the next offering. The contrast to the previous horses was stark. The animal that entered the arena was not sleek, nor did its coat gleam under the chandeliers. Its ribs pressed against its dull, matted hide, its eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Scars crisscrossed its body, remnants of neglect and mistreatment. It moved with hesitation, head lowered as though expecting another cruel rejection. Disgusted scoffs filled the room. A woman in pearls turned to her husband. "Why even bother bringing this thing out?" she muttered. The auctioneer forced a smile, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. "Lot number 74. A former racehorse, once a champion in his prime. Now, well, you see before you what remains." He hesitated. "Shall we start the bidding at 500? Silence. A tense pause stretched. The horse shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many judging eyes. A man near the front chuckled. "I'd pay to have it put down." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Perhaps 300? He scanned the room, but the previous excitement was gone. From the back of the room, the man clenched his jaw. He recognized the look in the horse's eyes, the same look he had seen in his own reflection once. A being discarded, judged by what it had lost rather than what it still had left to give. As the auctioneer prepared to move on, a voice rang out. "I'll bid." The laughter died instantly. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. "Pardon. I'll bid," the man repeated, his grip tightening around the paddle. Murmur swelled again, this time tinged with amusement and disbelief. Someone snorted. "You're wasting your money." The auctioneer hesitated, then recovered with a smirk. "Very well. We have a bid of 300. Do I hear for?" No response. 300 going once. A beat of silence. 300 going twice. The gavel slammed down. "Sold." The room erupted into murmurs, some hushed laughter. The man ignored them all. He strode forward, stepping closer to the horse. The animal flinched as he reached out, but he didn't pull away. He simply stood there, his presence steady. He saw the years of mistreatment etched into its trembling frame, but beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of fight. One of the stable hands handed over the worn lead rope, shaking his head. "You sure about this?" The man didn't answer. He just took the lead and started walking, leading the starved horse away from the auction floor. Behind him, the laughter continued. Let them laugh. They wouldn't be laughing for long. The road back was long and quiet. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of gravel under his boots and the soft, uneven steps of the horse beside him. The once proud creature moved hesitantly, its frail frame burdened not just by hunger, but by something deeper, an exhaustion born from years of neglect. Every few steps, it faltered, its legs trembling as if they might give out at any moment. The man slowed his pace, careful not to rush, allowing the animal to find its footing. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon by the time they reached the ranch. It wasn't grand, not the sprawling estates most auction attendees were used to, but it was enough. A stretch of land bordered by weathered fences, a barn that bore the marks of years but stood firm, and an open sky that seemed to stretch endlessly. The man led the horse past the paddocks, where his other animals lifted their heads in curiosity. They watched in silence as he guided the newcomer toward the stable, their ears flicking, their gazes questioning. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and leather filled the air, a comforting contrast to the sterile, perfumed halls of the auction house. The man unlatched a stall, leading the horse inside before stepping back to observe. It stood there, muscles tense, head low. It didn't explore, didn't sniff at the fresh bedding or lift its ears to the sound of rustling hay. It simply existed, as if the will to do anything more had been stripped from it long ago. The man moved slowly, crouching down to examine its legs. The scars told their own story, whip marks, old sores from ill-fitted saddles, a thinness that suggested months, maybe years, of neglect. He let out a slow breath, reaching for the bucket of grain he had set aside earlier. Lifting a handful, he extended it, letting the sweet scent of oats and molasses fill the space between them. The horse didn't move. Its nostrils flared slightly, its body still rigid, as if it expected the food to be taken away just as quickly as it had been offered. Minutes passed. The man remained still, unwavering, his arm steady. Finally, cautiously, the horse lowered its head. It sniffed, hesitated, then took the first bite. It was small, barely more than a nibble, but it was something. The man didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Instead, he simply set the bucket down within reach and stepped back, giving the horse space to decide for itself. He knew trust couldn't be forced, only earned. The following days were a test of patience. Each morning, he'd enter the stable to find the horse standing in the same spot, its body still carrying the tension of something waiting for a reason to run. He worked around it, moving with measured steps, speaking in low, steady tones. He didn't push, didn't expect more than what the horse was willing to give. Some days, that meant nothing at all. But then, small shifts began to appear. The first time it lifted its head at the sound of his voice. The first time it stepped forward when he entered the stall. The first time it accepted a gentle touch against its withers, without flinching. The scars wouldn't fade overnight, and neither would the fear. But piece by piece, the layers of distrust began to crack, revealing something buried beneath, the instinct to fight for survival. One evening, after a particularly long day of mending fences, the man returned to the barn to find the horse standing at the stall door. It wasn't much, just a shift in its usual posture, but something about it felt different. There was an awareness in its eyes, a quiet challenge. He met its gaze, waiting. Then, without warning, the horse stepped forward. It was a single movement, a brief moment where it closed the gap between them by choice rather than force. The man didn't react right away. He didn't reach out, didn't speak. He simply stood, allowing the silence to settle between them, letting the decision be the horse's alone. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. For a breathless second, the horse remained still. Then it leaned in, a fraction of weight, the softest brush of a muzzle against rough, callous skin. It was the smallest act of trust, but it was everything. The training began slowly, at a pace dictated by the horse rather than the man. The first few days were spent simply walking together, no saddles, no reins, just movement side by side. The horse's steps were tentative at first, each stride uncertain, but as the days passed, they found a rhythm. The man never pulled, never forced. He let the horse learn on its own that it was safe to move forward. The first attempt at a saddle was met with resistance. As soon as the leather touched its back, the horse's entire body tensed. Its breathing quickened, muscles coiled tight, as if expecting pain. The man didn't push. He removed the saddle as quickly as he had placed it, stepping back, giving space. It took days before the horse allowed the saddle to rest against its back without protest. Even longer before it would tolerate the weight of a rider. The man never rushed, never let frustration seep into his actions. He knew that trust, once broken, was fragile, and that healing could not be forced. Each small victory mattered. The first time the horse walked a full circle around the paddock with the saddle strapped tight. The first time it allowed the man to mount without shying away. The first time it moved under his weight, hesitant but willing. They trained in silence, their communication built not on words but on movement, on trust. The horse learned to listen to the shift of his weight, the slightest pressure of his legs, the subtle commands that asked rather than demanded. The day they ventured beyond the paddock, out into the open fields, was the day the horse truly came alive again. At first, the pace was slow, careful. The man kept the reins loose, his body relaxed. He could feel the tension in the horse's frame, the hesitation in its steps. Then something shifted. The wind picked up, rustling through the grass, and the horse's ears flicked forward. Its nostrils flared, its muscles coiled, not in fear, but in something else. The man didn't push. He simply loosened his grip, giving the horse a choice. And in the next breath, the horse ran. It wasn't the careful, measured trot of training. It wasn't the tentative steps of something still bound by its past. It was a gallop, wild, unrestrained, a force of nature rediscovering its own strength. The man didn't pull back. He didn't try to control. He simply let the horse be free. And for the first time, the horse no longer ran from something. It ran because it wanted to. The gavel had barely struck the podium before the murmurs began again. The auction hall, once filled with dismissive laughter and scorn, now stood frozen in disbelief. Just moments ago, the skeletal horse with hollowed eyes had been nothing more than an object of ridicule, an unwanted creature deemed unworthy of a second glance. Yet now, he was the highest bid in the entire auction. Isaac remained seated, his posture unwavering despite the storm of whispers around him. His face betrayed nothing, no triumph, no anger, only the steady determination that had driven him to this moment. Across the hall, the auctioneer adjusted his glasses, still struggling to process what had just happened. He had spent years presiding over the sale of fine horses, prized stallions, thoroughbreds with champion bloodlines, creatures that dripped with the promise of power and wealth. But never had he seen something like this. Going once, the auctioneer said, clearing his throat. Going twice. A man in the back, arms crossed over his chest, let out a sharp laugh. This a joke, he scoffed. That thing ain't worth a dime, let alone the highest bid of the night. Isaac turned, his gaze locking onto the man with an icy calm. You don't see his worth, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. That doesn't mean it isn't there. Silence followed. The murmurs died down, replaced by the weight of an undeniable truth. The gavel slammed down. Sold. With that single word, everything shifted. Isaac rose, his heart hammering, though he refused to let it show. He had expected resistance. He had expected ridicule. But none of that mattered now. The horse, this battered, discarded creature, was his. As he made his way toward the pen where the animal had been kept, a stable hand trailed beside him. Look, sir, I don't mean to be rude, but what are you going to do with him? The young man hesitated before adding, no one else wanted him for a reason. He ain't got much left in him. Isaac glanced at him, then at the horse behind the rusted metal bars. The animal barely lifted his head. His coat, once a rich chestnut, was dulled with dirt and neglect. His ribs jutted out like jagged stones beneath paper-thin skin. Flies hovered over the wounds on his legs, reminders of the suffering he had endured. Isaac stepped closer, ignoring the sharp smell of decay and illness. The horse didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He had learned long ago that nothing he did mattered. "You're wrong," Isaac said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "He has everything left." The stable hand shook his head but said nothing more. The paperwork was finalized. The arrangements were made. And as Isaac led the horse away from the auction grounds, the crowd watched in silence, their mocking smirks now replaced with something else, something neither of them had expected to see. Respect. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The first night was the hardest. Isaac had brought the horse, who he had now named Gideon, back to his ranch, a quiet stretch of land far removed from the noise and judgment of the world. It wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary, a place where the broken found a way to heal. Gideon didn't fight when Isaac led him into the open stable, though every step was labored, his body barely able to carry its own weight. Once inside, he stood motionless, his dull eyes staring blankly ahead. Isaac watched him for a long time, knowing he could do nothing but give the animal time to adjust. The next morning, the real work began. Isaac moved slowly, speaking in low, measured tones as he brought Gideon fresh water and food. At first, the horse ignored him, too accustomed to hunger to trust the offering. But Isaac was patient. He waited. He let Gideon come to his own conclusion. It took 3 days before the horse took his first hesitant bites. A week before he no longer recoiled at the touch of Isaac's hand. 2 weeks before he stepped out of the stable without fear. Day by day, inch by inch, progress was made. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't an instant transformation. It was hard work, grueling patience, and a commitment to proving to Gideon that he was safe, that he mattered. And then, one evening, something changed. Isaac had been tending to the other horses when he felt a presence beside him. He turned and found Gideon standing there, unprompted, his large, dark eyes fixed on him with something Isaac had not seen before. Trust. The breakthrough was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but to Isaac, it meant everything. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. Months passed, and Gideon became stronger. The bones that once pressed sharply against his skin had softened beneath new layers of muscle. His coat, once matted and filthy, gleamed under the sunlight, revealing the deep chestnut beneath. But more than the physical changes, there was something else, something more profound. Gideon had found his spirit again. Isaac worked with him every day, building the horse's confidence, testing his limits in the gentlest of ways. At first, Gideon had been hesitant to even walk freely in the pastures. Now he galloped across them, his hooves kicking up dust as he moved with a grace and power that no one had believed he would ever have again. The town had taken notice. Whispers turned to curiosity. Curiosity turned to awe. And soon, the very same people who had laughed at him at the auction were now asking about the horse they had once rejected. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The event was unplanned. A local competition, a showcase for fine horses and their riders. Isaac hadn't intended to bring Gideon. Not at first. But something in him knew. This was the moment. The murmurs began again when they arrived, just as they had at the auction house. The same eyes that had once dismissed the battered creature now watched in stunned silence as Isaac led Gideon onto the field. He had never intended to make a statement. But that's exactly what they had done. The gates opened. The course was set. And with a steady hand and an unbreakable bond, Isaac and Gideon moved as one. The air was electric, charged with the impossible reality of what they were witnessing. Gideon was not the broken creature they had seen months ago. He was something else entirely. He was proof that worth was not dictated by appearance, that resilience was not defined by past suffering, that a second chance could change everything. And when they crossed the finish line, the crowd rose to their feet. No one laughed this time. No one whispered in doubt, because Gideon had proved them all wrong.